Okay, before we get into the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the laws of wearing shoes in Yom Kippur, I mentioned we talk about prosthetic legs. So, in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, in the laws of Shabbos, chapter 301, verse 12, he says following at least a variation morning of the reading of our Gemara we did on Wednesday, was it? That he shouldn't go out on Shabbos wearing his wooden peg leg. And he explains there, as you mentioned, according to those who understand, the reason you shouldn't wear it is because it's decorative. But the stick he needs to actually walk, his crutches, that he may wear because he needs it to walk, and therefore he's allowed to wear it. So obviously, any prosthetic leg that a person needs to walk, one may wear on Shabbos. The question is only, or the prohibition is only, if it's a leg that's there just for aesthetic purposes. A person wants to make it look like he has two legs, and put a wooden stump. I don't know why we do that. We end up dragging around more weight, but I suppose it was something people used to do. It's carrying, because they're not wearing it. It's carrying, right? If you're wearing something, it's not considered carrying, right? Now, so a tie is considered an article of clothing, right? The question is not whether it's strapped on. The question is not whether it's strapped on. The question is if it's considered an article of clothing. You can have, I can have my backpack strapped onto me, and it's still considered carrying, because it's not an article of clothing. I'm carrying the load, right? So that's a big question. For men, for women, what kind of jewelry? Yes, no, it's not so simple, this jewelry business. Wearing on Shabbos. There's a whole chapter in Masechta Shabbos, the Ma'yeh Isha Yotze. It's a whole tractate in Shabbos discussing this very law about jewelry and when it's considered carrying, and the concern that a woman might take it off to show off to her friend while she's walking. It's not exactly that simple. Although, of course, you see many women wearing jewelry on Shabbos and Shul. But that's not the discussion right now, but you're correct, there is a discussion. But I just want to mention that the Alter Rebbe has a note on that section in chapter 301 where it discusses the laws of Shabbos, and there it's a very lengthy piece which I did not get to go through, at least not in depth. I read through it, just casually, and there the Alter Rebbe gets into the cross references between the Gemara there and the Gemara, our Gemara, because our Gemara also has a discussion: is it a shoe or not? And at least according to some opinions, it is a shoe, right? And we have this discussion about whether you're allowed to wear it in Yom Kippur or not. And when it comes to Yom Kippur, there's a bit of a double-edged sword, because if it's considered a shoe, then you can't wear it because on Yom Kippur you're not allowed to wear shoes. And if it's not considered a shoe, you can't wear it because you're carrying. So you're stuck in a catch-22 on Yom Kippur. Okay, well, assuming there's no Eruv, yes, assuming there's violation of carrying. So that's the kind of catch-22 which will frame the discussion that we're about to do right now in Halakha. Here, it's in English. You can follow. Yes. So no. Okay, that's another question. Even Rosh Hashanah, we're going to see that. So that's a big question. But the Gemara says that both agree it's considered a shoe. So I just close this. But the Alter Rebbe quotes the Ran, the Rif, which says that when the Gemara says both agree that it's considered a shoe, it's a Meir and a B'yasi, but the sages disagree with that. And then the question becomes why there are more paskins that way. And even though he's inconsistent because he follows Rabbi Yerucham elsewhere, it's a very long, complicated pilpul, which you can have a look at later. But the bottom line is our Gemara itself is not freestanding. There's lots of cross references and makes it a very intricate subject. But let's see now the laws on a practical level. But at least for now, in answering the practical question we began on Wednesday, which is about wearing prosthetic legs, answer is yes. Because if you need it for walking, you are allowed to wear it. Should God forbid one be in such a situation. Yes, crutches or a prosthetic leg or something like that. Even because over here he's talking about a cane, even a stick you're allowed to walk around with. So even a crutch you're allowed to walk with if you need it for walking. If it's a question of aesthetics, then that's where this whole detailed discussion gets into, whether it's considered a shoe or not a shoe, etc. Okay.
With the cane, without a cane, that's the question.
All right. Siman Tafresh Yudalit, section or chapter 614, laws of anointing oneself and wearing shoes on Yom Kippur, 11 halachas. Aleph Sika Ketzad. First of all, the Alter Rebbe does just one paragraph on the issue of anointing oneself, all of which we learned in the Gemara already, which is Sika Ketzad. How do we define the prohibition of anointing oneself on Yom Kippur? Forbidden to anoint oneself, covering the entire body or part of the body equally, both prohibited. Just like with washing part of the body and washing the whole body is equally prohibited. The im haya chayla, and if the person was sick, afilu ein by sakana, even if there's no danger to him, or if he has scabs on his head, he can put on the anointment and does not have to worry, as we learned in the Gemara. Why? Because the prohibition is only anointing whose purpose is just the pleasure of it, just as washing. When it came to washing, the prohibition was only with regard to washing of pleasure. So likewise, the anointing, the prohibition is only with the washing of pleasure. However, there is a small distinction, and that is as follows. If the person is not sick, even if he doesn't intend here that he's anointing himself for pleasure, but he's doing it to get rid of sweat. So say a deodorant or odorless deodorant. So I'm not doing it for the smell. I'm not doing it because I like it. I'm just doing it to remove the perspiration. Also, it's forbidden. Now, and in this regard, it's not exactly the same as washing. And when it came to washing, we had a whole chapter basically, which came down to, or at least half a chapter discussing this, which came down to, so long as you're not washing your whole body and your intention is not pleasure. You're walking through water to get to a mitzvah, you're walking to water to get to shul. It's permissible. But when it comes to anointing oneself, if a person is doing it for some purpose that isn't expressly for healing purposes, it's forbidden. Why? Because ordinarily, when one anoints oneself, there's automatically more pleasure, more enjoyment, more than just washing. Therefore, they were more stringent. And therefore, they forbade it, even if you don't have explicit pleasure you don't have explicit intention for pleasure. Unless there's an expressive intention that isn't pleasurable. For example, it's for medical reasons. In other words, like this. There's always three intentions you can have. There's intention for something, the intention for nothing, or not for that thing, and then the intention in the opposite. So in other words, there's intention, I'm doing it for pleasure, for sure forbidden. And then there is, when you have intention not for pleasure, what's your intention? Is your intention simply not for pleasure? Or is your intention expressly for something else which you require regardless of pleasure? And there's your three categories. For pleasure, for sure not. Both washing and anointing. Pleasure, intention that isn't pleasure. Washing, yes. Anointing, no. So for example, I'm doing it just to get rid of the sweat. So I don't have intention that I'm doing this in spite of pleasure. It's just, that's right. But I'm very close to enjoying it. In fact, I'm doing it to get rid of some dirt, or to get rid of perspiration. But then I'm doing it for medicinal purposes. And in that instance, even if it were in spite of pleasure, I would still do it because I'm doing it for medicinal purposes. And that's when it's permissible to anoint oneself on Yom Kippur. Sorry? So I mentioned this last time. Most of the medicinal prohibition of Shabbos is with regard to pills. And when it comes to anointing, there is some restrictions. But you have to go to those laws. You'll see that at length about smearing and not smearing, tapping, putting your hands into oil versus pouring the oil on you, all kinds of different so let's see what note 2 says. The Alter Rebbe writes that in these regions, it is not customary to anoint oneself with oil except for medicinal reasons, and therefore on Shabbos one may not anoint his head with where there are scabs. For the sages ban this use of medicinal purpose on Shabbos for ailments that are not severe. So in other words, over there, they only did it for ointment, and they only did it for medicinal, therefore it's prohibited. That's interesting. It must therefore be assumed that the Alter Rebbe is speaking about the practice in countries where even healthy people customarily anoint themselves during the week. It is therefore permitted to anoint oneself on Shabbos because it is not obvious that this is being done for medicinal reasons. Yeah, so I know that the Alter Rebbe talks about over there about putting your hands into water or milk rather than smearing it on you. Anyway, okay. Oops. Didn't have access to
olives or olive oil, but in Middle East, olive oil is
They
very common.
they probably used fish oil or whale oil. No, it's too far also. So what kind of oil are they using?
For washing. They didn't wash much. They didn't use much oil.
But they must have oil for lamps.
Yeah, like kerosene, but it wasn't washing.
Right. Okay. So those are too expensive to just use it wantonly. All right, interesting. Okay. Now we get to our subject, which is wearing shoes in Yom Kippur. How do we define what is the prohibition of wearing shoes in Yom Kippur? Also, in the middle of it's forbidden to wear shoes of leather and sandals of leather. Even on one leg. It's always forbidden. This does not come from our Gemara. It actually comes from a Gemara in Yevamis. So you can look at footnote 4. Yevamit 102b. Mystical basis of prohibition. Leather shoes serve an intermediary through which one man comes in contact with the earth. Thus, on ordinary days, they enable him to perform his life of elevating material and transform it into a medium for holiness. In Yom Kippur, the material world is elevated by spiritual influences on the day itself. Leather shoes they're no longer necessary. Indeed, they interfere and dull one's appreciation of the day's unique power. Leather is this metaphor for interacting with the physical world. And on Yom Kippur, we are to disengage from the physical world. But as you see at the top, sorry? Okay, so why mourn is a different thing. But when it comes to Yom Kippur, this is the explanation. At any rate, you can see here that the source is Yevamis 102b, not our Gemara, which is why it wasn't explicitly stated in our Gemara, although it could be inferred from our Gemara, because as we saw, our Gemara allowed everything else, as we'll see. Okay, even if a person's wearing a sandal of wood, and it's covered in leather, also it's forbidden because it has leather component. If a person is, God forbid, has an amputee missing a leg, also he cannot wear his stick. Again, it's only for aesthetic purposes, not as an actual. Not the actual shoe. He just explains what this prosthetic leg looks like. It's a stump which has a cavity in which a person puts the rest of their whatever's left of their leg. I'm sorry, it's forbidden to wear it if it's covered in leather. Sorry. If possible, a person should be stringent not to wear a wooden shoe, even if it's not lined with leather. And that's because, sorry? If it's covered in leather. Only it's covered in leather, yes.
If it's only wood, would be allowed.
There'll be 1 second. So, it's for, yes, okay, you're right. It's not for aesthetics. It could be for, I guess it's for walking. Otherwise, you'd be carrying. Yes. So you're right. It's for walking here. Now, what's interesting is, why does Alter Rebbe say that it's best to be stringent even if it's of wood without any leather? Because of the opinion. That's correct. Because of the opinion, if you learn our Gemara, if you learn the Pshat in our Gemara as we learned it yesterday, that everybody agrees this wooden stump is considered a shoe, then according to that opinion, wood is the same thing as leather. Right? In other words, our Gemara didn't say anything except for leather. Our Gemara listed things permissible. And on the list of prohibition was the stump. Right? And we defined it on Wednesday that it's nothing to do with comfort. We said because according to all opinions, it's defined as a shoe. Now, if you follow that opinion, then this is a shoe you can't wear in Yom Kippur. Comfortable or not comfortable. Which would mean, according to that opinion, wooden shoes are forbidden. That's why it says to be stringent. Although, as I mentioned before from Alter Rebbe in Shin Aleph, in Hilchos Shabbos, where he quotes the Ran, which says Rif, which says that our Gemara, which says it is a shoe, is only according to two opinions, whereas the sages disagree and say it's not a shoe. And therefore he says it's not a shoe. unless it has leather, but to be stringent and cover that opinion. Right? What does it say here in the footnote in number? As you can see there.
But Rome mentioned, well, not mentioned in Torah, that the reason why he allows to say the cloth around the foot because you don't.
We're going to see it in a second. We'll get it in a second. And this is their logic here. But motilino sandal, one may wear shoes made of, over here also translated as reeds, vishal kash, or straw, vishal beged, or some other cloth, vishal minim, or any other material, rubber included, or plastic included. Why? Because the bumps in the earth are felt on his feet, and he feels as if he wasn't wearing shoes. Now, if that's the case, if the question of what defines a shoe is such that you don't feel the bumps on the earth, then with a wooden shoe, you wouldn't either feel the bumps on the earth, just with leather. And that would be the logic why it's forbidden, if you're to be concerned with that opinion. But, says out there, but there's another reason why leather is forbidden and why the others are permissible. Not because you don't feel the bumps, or because you do feel the bumps, that's why it's permissible. The other reason is because the prohibition is only wearing a shoe. And therefore, anything that's not a shoe, anything that's not leather is not defined as a shoe, but rather as a garment. So two reasons why, two ways of classifying what the prohibition of not wearing a shoe is. One way of classifying it is a question of feeling the bumps in the earth. If it's a question of feeling the bumps in the earth, then wood forbidden and leather forbidden. Both of them are strong enough to withhold. And not necessarily. With running shoes, you might feel the bumps in the earth. No, a good running shoe, you wouldn't. So I guess so. But the other reason here is, and this seems to be the dominant reason, is that just the way a shoe is defined is leather, is made of leather. If it's not leather, it's considered an article of clothing. And that would explain why you're allowed to wear it on Shabbos. Even if it's not considered a shoe, it's still considered clothing. And if it's considered clothing, you're allowed to wear it on Shabbos. So in other words, the non-leather shoes you wear on Yom Kippur, the reason why they're permissible is either for one of two reasons, but probably primarily the second reason, which is it's not defined as a shoe. It's an article of clothing, and if you're allowed to wear it. Now, just an interesting thing, because it's here. So here the Alter Rebbe's line is, in the first reason, that the reason why it's prohibited is because you cannot feel the bumps in the earth. Right? Now, this line comes from the Rambam, and the Rambam writes the words, koishi, you cannot feel the hardness of the earth. Whereas the Rambam, Alter Rebbe changes it, or seems like it changes it, and writes, you cannot feel the bumps in the earth. So which one is it, the hardness of the earth or the bumps of the earth? So somebody asked this to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe wrote a comment here like this. The Rebbe says that there's a print of the Rambam that was printed in Rome in the year Reish Mem. Where's Reish Mem? Some 600 something years ago. 600 plus years ago. 700 plus years ago, I'm sorry, because we're Tufshin. Reish Mem about 700 years ago in Rome. There was a print of the Rambam. So it's 700 years ago. It's not long after the Rambam passed away, within the century or so. And there it says that the hardness of the earth, magiyin l'ragav, come to his leg, but there the word come to his leg is in plural. Magiyin. The hardness of the earth, in plural, reaches his legs. Magia means to reach. Right? The way we have it in our version is koishi haaretz magia l'ragav. The hardness of the earth reaches his leg, but reaches in the singular, magia. Whereas this old print has magiyin in the plural. Now it says the Rebbe, therefore perhaps the Alter Rebbe felt that there's two mistakes that could be here. Either the mistake is in the singular versus the plural, or the mistake is koishi, hardness, which is not, it's the hardness of the earth. You wouldn't say that it reaches you in the plural. But the bumps of the earth do come to you in plural. Goishi. And therefore says the Rebbe that perhaps the Alter Rebbe was thinking that it's more likely that the mistake is changing a gimel to a kuf, a gimel meaning goishi, bumps, and that would explain why it's plural, rather than say it's supposed to be koishi, the hardness of the earth, and then change the magiyin into singular. This is the Rebbe's explanation. It's just an interesting thing. You find this old prince.
Even also the hardness of the earth means like stones and things like that.
Then that means bumps anyway.
Yeah.
Then that is bumps.
It's not just obstacles in the earth. You feel them.
Then that would be bumps, right? If it's no, but hardness of the earth just means you feel the hardness of the earth, right? It's not exactly. If you're saying it means pebbles, then it would be more appropriate to say the bumps, right? Then the Alter Rebbe is basically teaching. Then, at any rate, the Rebbe just concludes by saying by Dayan Tzarech Iyun. I mean, it still requires investigation to see exactly why the Alter Rebbe changed it from Koishi to Goishi. And what exactly would be the practical application difference? If you had something hard enough, I don't know, something thin enough that you would feel the bump but not feel the hardness. I don't know exactly when you would feel it, when there would be a halachic application difference in these two words. I don't know, but this is just an interesting little tidbit. Sorry? The Rambam. Yes, that's another question where the Rambam got it from. But certainly the Alter Rebbe got it from the Rambam. Right? Yeah, we'll have to leave that to the Kesef Mishnah, the Maggid Mishnah. Okay, yeah.
More sensitive level of awareness of the ground.
Right, but how do you define that sensitivity? How do you define that sensitivity? I'm always aware of the earth and the ground. I guess when I walk on my leather shoes, I feel the hardness of the leather rather than the hardness of the earth, right? I don't know exactly how you define this. In other words, well, it could be, for example, especially today, you could have like, let's say, a pair of Crocs. You might feel the bumps in the earth, but you don't feel the hardness of the earth. Right? Yeah. Okay. At any rate. Okay, continue the Alter Rebbe. Let's see how far we can go. It's likewise permissible to wrap a hard cloth, a stiff cloth, around one's foot. And it's permissible even to walk into a public domain. This is a very, very interesting halacha. Even though if you were to take a cloth and tie it to your leg throughout the rest of the year, you cannot carry that on Shabbos. Why? Because it's not a shoe. It's not a shoe, and it's not a clothing area either. It's just a cloth tied to your leg, and that would be carrying. But because on Yom Kippur you cannot wear proper shoes, and you cannot put on a leather shoe, therefore for today it's considered as if you're wearing it. Isn't that interesting? So even though all year long this cloth would be considered carrying on Shabbos, because it's not the way you properly wear something, but nonetheless, because in Yom Kippur this is your only option to cover your feet when you're walking on the street, so for today it's considered a clothing. Very, very, very interesting halacha. And here he tells us the source and the taz and the lavush. Okay, v'yesh oisin. However, there are those who disagree with this, and they say it's forbidden. He says you can wear it in Yom Kippur because it's not considered a shoe, and therefore it's permitted. But you can only wear it in such a domain that you're allowed to carry on Yom Kippur. But you couldn't take it into the public arena because it might be considered carrying. Unless he is going to a mitzvah or to some other thing that he has to do on Yom Kippur. In other words, if this was his only option to get to Shul on Yom Kippur without cutting his legs, then you can wear it according to this opinion. Sorry? It's not considered a garment, or at least it's a questionable garment. Right? Sorry?
Make a distinction.
Our Gemara is not making a distinction between. That's why I said that's why I said at the beginning. That's this catch-22 is what frames the issue. If it's a shoe, you can't wear it on Yom Kippur. If it's not a shoe, you can't carry it. So we saw here that there's this geder, there's this other classification of something which is worn as an article of clothing, and therefore you can carry it, but not a shoe, and therefore you can wear it on Yom Kippur. This is like this unique classification. But then when you come to a hard cloth, now you're kind of stuck. That's because it's a hard cloth. So you want to tell me that the hard cloth is considered like a garment? It's uncomfortable. It's not a garment. It's a burden. But if this is your only option, we'll say, at least for today, it's considered a garment. Right? It's an interesting classification. Okay. But continues. So if this is the only way to wear it, If it's the only thing available to him and needs to get to shul and needs to do some other errand that he has to do on Yom Kippur, some mitzvah, then he can wear this because this is his only option. But this is only if he is a particular kind of person. And socks are not good enough for him. Because socks are too thin and he's going to feel all the earth and the dirt, and it's too difficult for him to walk like that, so he can put on these shoes. Then he's allowed to walk in the public domain with these hard cloth. The karach of the ragla is tied to his leg, because at least for today, this would be considered as clothing, even though it's not considered a shoe either, and it's not considered as clothing on ordinary Shabbos. It's best to be stringent and not to wear it on Yom Kippur if you can avoid it. Avol, but to go out in the public domain wearing cloth socks, mutter is permissible in every regard, according to everybody. Why? It's not considered a shoe. Certainly, it's a sock. And number two, it's not a shoe, and therefore he's allowed to wear it in Yom Kippur. But likewise, he's also wearing it in the proper manner, and therefore it's not considered carrying. And therefore, likewise, allowed to wear every other kind of shoe, so long as it's not leather, which, as we said before, if it's not leather, it's not classified as a shoe. And he's allowed to wear it in Yom Kippur, and he's allowed to carry it, he's allowed to take it in the public domain because, as you mentioned, he's wearing it as an article of clothing. Right, so now you know why you're allowed to wear rubber shoes. Answer, because it's an article of clothing and not a shoe. So in Halacha 3, he brought the first opinion, it would seem, to explain the sentence before it. But the second opinion is his primary view. That's what it would seem. Okay. One is allowed to stand and sit on, or certainly sit, but even stand on leather cushions. Because this is not the way of you enjoy shoes, even though it happens to be standing on leather and you happen to like it. But you're not enjoying it as a shoe. You're enjoying it as a floor. And the prohibition is only when he wears it on his leg as a shoe. But one who decides on his own to be stringent and not step on leather cushions and leather carpets or floors, good for him. And literally, may blessings be upon him. Meaning, it's an admirable thing to be stringent. The medvar mamurim, all this is well. This is all true when he's not davening Shemon Esrei. But when he's davening Shemon Esrei, it's funny. He's calling it Shemon Esrei because that's the name it's been given. But Shemon Esrei literally means 18. And it's called 18 because we have 18. Originally, there were 18 brachas. Today we have 19. But originally, there were 18 brachas in the Amidah. But on Yom Kippur, there never was and never will be 18 brachas in the Amidah. It's 9. But nonetheless, it's being classified and called Shemon Esrei. No, Yom Kippur 7. Shana is 9. But anyway, he calls it Shemon Esrei. It's interesting. But so while you're davening the Amidah, as we would call it, or the Shemon Esrei, as he calls it here, it is forbidden to stand on any cushions or pillows, even if it's not made of leather, because it looks as if he's being haughty. He is like self-aggrandizement, standing on a little platform while praying, standing on any kind of cushion. In fact, there's a whole set of halachas in and of itself about standing on an elevated platform, and how high it is and how not high it is. But over here is not talking about a question of height. Just the very fact that he's standing on a cushion is already in itself appears like he's full of pride and self-aggrandizement, and therefore forbidden to do so, unrelated to Yom Kippur, anytime. So that's a serious question about an elevated platform for a chazan, and the question is how high it is, and the question is how big it is, if it's considered an individual platform, and the question is if it has does it have a railing around it, if it's lower, if it's higher, how many steps. There is a set of laws. But the bottom line is our bima here I don't think our bima here is high enough to constitute being elevated. And B, I think it's big enough that even if it was high enough, it would be considered its own individual platform rather than be considered elevated from the rest of the platform. Meaning the prohibition essentially is to stand on a crate, where really you're standing on this floor, but you're elevated on this floor. If you have your own floor, then it's permissible. But at what point does it become its own floor? That's a question of how big it is and whether it has railings. So ours is forbidden for those reasons, permissible for those reasons. Sorry? No. Okay, but mutter lamed ashat dvarim chutz mikar maklasis afilu b'shas shebespal tzas shmoneser in ein agav shashvachim min haaretz k'mishis babis mitzadik. And this is what he's referring to. It is permissible to stand on other platforms while he's davening that isn't cushions, so long as it's not higher than 3 tvachim, because once it is higher than 3 tvachim, as mentioned, there's the laws in section 90, as he says here, the laws related to prayer, in which there are conditions about whether or not one is allowed to be on an elevated platform, and if it's under the 3 tvachim, then it isn't considered elevated, and it's permissible to stand on it. If it's over 3 tvachim, then there are other things that can make it permissible, as you just mentioned. Okay, there's time for some more. It's 10 to 9. Because now we start the new section. Okay, so God willing, we'll continue. We'll finish this on Monday. It's not so much more. Okay, we'll finish it on Monday and then get back to our Gemara. And the next part of the Gemara is going to get into eating on Yom Kippur and when a sick person can eat and how to measure how much that sick person should eat. And that's going to be a lot of fun. It's very practical stuff. In a way, it's more practical than the rest of the stuff. The rest of the stuff we said till now is just don't do it. Okay, finished. Okay, we found out you're allowed to wear leather shoes. You're allowed to wear non-leather shoes. Okay, enjoy. Now to wash yourself, okay, don't wash yourself. Wash your hands for needle to dime only till your knuckles. You got that. Good. When it comes to eating, there are so many variables and situations arrive that are unexpected that it's going to be a lot of fun to learn those halachas, God willing. Yeah, we're gonna get into all of that, God willing.